All right, part 4. Okay, you're on Bulletproof Publishers landing page. Just go down to part 4, Christian Dispensationalism and the Social Gospel. This is where Brandeis influences Christianity, mainly through this guy and this guy. So William Eugene Blackstone, the guy on the far right here, he's one of the founders of dispensationalism, along with this guy in the center, John Nelson Darby. But William Eugene Blackstone is considered by Brandeis, his lieutenants, and even Benjamin Netanyahu as the founder of Israel, because a lot of his work predates even Herzl, as evidenced by the 1891 Blackstone petition. So Walter Rauschenbusch, this character here, he's the father of the social gospel. And his son marries Brandeis' daughter, and today they are still at the top of influence of the Interfaith Alliance. We'll show you that at the end of this presentation. So you can see there's a two-pronged attack. He's using the Christian Dispensationalist movement and the social gospel. They all have similar parallels as the progressive movement, the Fabian Society, socialists, right? And everybody else involved in this story. So socialism offered not only a radical critique of American political and economic institutions, it also offered the seal, symbols, and sense of participation in a world-transforming cause often associated with Christianity itself. So that's Jacob H. Dorn. He's writing in the Social Gospel and Socialism, a comparison of the thoughts of Francis Greenwood Peabody with Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. So Blackstone and the Dispensationalists, William Eugene Blackstone was a very well-known evangelical minister of his day and is considered a founder of dispensationalism, along with John Nelson Darby, James Inglis, James Hall Brooks, Cyrus Ingerson Schofield, and Dwight D. Moody. Christian dispensationalism, simply put, is a literal interpretation of the Bible. Dispensationalists preach of an approaching cataclysmic global event as described in the book of Revelations. So this literal interpretation of the Bible is a dead giveaway. As soon as they start talking second coming of Christ, you can rest assured that it is propaganda. These Christians have been propagandized against. Now, before I offend any Christians, I want you to know that this is actually helpful for you to show how a clown show was attached to your religion. This is really the aspect that people don't like about Christianity, is this telling everybody that the second coming of Christ is coming and you're going to go to hell, and born again Christianity, all of these things. This is all to do with dispensationalism, the fear of the future. So this fear of the future also aligning with mainstream media and a lot of the truth movement. So this group of men, more than any other, popularized the biblical stories of the tribulation, the rapture, millennialism, otherwise broadly known as the second coming of Christ. More important to this story, dispensationalists were also greatly influential in the promotion and eventual creation of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine in 1917. Christian dispensationalism recognizing the rightful return of God's chosen people to Israel. So you can see how this message from God in the Bible that says that land is yours, right? The Bible isn't a sourced document. Nobody really knows who the author is. And to use it as a historical document to start claiming, regions or geographical regions as your own is dubious, to say the least, especially to a forensic historian or an investigative journalist or anybody interested in using proper logic and historical method in trying to figure out history. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to collect artifacts, put them all together, and let's see what everybody thinks, right? So it's interesting that we just talked about how Brandeis created Israel in 1917. And we can see also that they're using the dispensational movement along with other Christian movements too, like the Chatter, not going to come up with it. It's the movement that really started the Pacific Palisades, the first Christian movement traveling sideshow in the Pacific Palisades. It was all owned by these Christians. I want to say Chappaquiddick, but it's not. It's an Indian word, and they're known for traveling around the nation and trying to recruit people into their Christian movement. Anyways, so here's one of the basis for the Jew being in Palestine is from Genesis 12:2-3. And I, God, will make of thee, Israelites, a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee all families of earth be blessed. Okay, so it's very similar, eerily similar to what televangelists are saying today. A lot of times you'll see in these churches that there's the cross and the Star of David at the front of the church together, overlapping each other. So these biblical concepts, much to our surprise, weren't established tens of thousands of years ago. This idea of dispensationalism or the second coming of Christ, the popularity of millennialism, the rapture, tribulation, this great cataclysmic event before the return of Christ and then 1,000 years of peace. Sounds like Marxism. And I'm just saying that's what Marxists say, is that in order for utopia, there has to be a cataclysmic moment in history where capitalism falls. So either way, we're kind of right there. So these biblical concepts, much to our surprise, weren't established tens of thousands of years ago, but a little more than a century ago. These men were instrumental in spreading the gospel of a future end times where world wars and social upheavals would lead to a new world order or a new kingdom of God or a new heaven on earth is the terms that they use. So we already begin to see parallels between the future promises of Christianity and both socialism and the progressive movement. A subtle form of modernism entering the church, the idea of a utopia. Today, this strain of Christianity, more popularly known as progressive dispensationalism. You can see they're all overlapping, connected. And, methods and means to their ends are the only things that are really being discussed. But the ends are all very similar. The perfectibility of man. So that aligns also with the Jesuits, the Catholic Church, the Illuminati, freemasonry, Kabbalah. So Dwight Lyman Moody was the most popular evangelical of the day and is considered the predecessor to televangelism. And the likes of Billy Graham, Jimmy Swaggart, Jerry Falwell, Jim Baker, Joel Osteen, and Oral Roberts. The Moody Bible Institute of Chicago was the inspired model for many Bible colleges around America, forming a theological network, helping propagate faith in a literal translation of the Bible. So you can see how they've spread across America, much like the Association of American Universities. And Efficiency, Taylor Society, like the Protocol of Peace, how they said that once they had established these things in New York, they could then spread to other states around the nation. So this is why I say that, knowing all this history for a Christian is priceless, because you can say, don't listen to those idiot televangelists. We're not, us as Christians aren't associated with that kind of Christianity. That is more so to make a buck and to spread fear. See how it can actually de-escalate arguments. This is why it's very helpful for both the secular and religious segments of our society, because all of a sudden, the most irritating aspect of Christianity, this belief that there's a second coming and we all have to get right with God or we're going to burn in hell, isn't actually real. It's a man-made myth, just like I said with one of my Facebook shares. Once you start to realize that all of these things are man-made myths, waking up actually sort of becomes enjoyable, in that you start to realize that nothing's really different. This is one of the realizations I made with climate change, that it's all largely synthetic fabrication, man-made. And we've shown that through the Club of Rome documents. Excuse me. So the Moody Bible Institute spreads these colleges around the United States, create a theological network. These men all having one thing in common even today, in that they all preach end times through a literal translation of the Bible and support the followers of Judaism as God's chosen people, and support emphatically their right to a homeland in Palestine. So John Nelson Darby is considered the father of dispensationalism, futurism, and premillennial tribulation rapture, and was much older than the rest, born in 1800. Darby, a pioneer within the Plymouth Brethren and founder of the Exclusive Brethren, little segments within. So the Brethren, a network of like-minded Protestant churches. Darby promoted sola scriptura, common to nearly all Protestant denominations, believing the word of the Bible is the one true infallible authority. So Darby's eschatology was then popularized through the publication of the Scofield Reference Bible in 1909 and again in 1917. Today, thanks to Darby and C.I. Scofield, we have well over 100 million American Christians interpreting the Bible literally, fearing the future, and believing it is all in God's hands. Now, that's amazing, because it's not just the 100 million that call themselves Christians, but a large segment of the population that would call themselves secular would also believe this. If not, literally, they certainly understand the concept. It's well known, whether you're religious or not. And then this fearing the future and believing that it is all in God's hands is very deterministic, in that if the universe is already settled and everything in the future already is as it's supposed to be, then we don't actually have to activate, get off our couches and do anything. Right? So it's parallel in that. They're trying not to get you activated. They're trying to tell you that they're trying to assuage you, placate you, just tell you that everything's fine. God's got it all under control, just like the government will tell you. So note, Aleister Crowley's parents were both members of the Exclusive Brethren, his father an evangelist. After attending Eastbourne College under the supervision of a brethren brother named Lambert, Aleister would leave to pursue a well-documented life immersed in mysticism and the occult. So this is where he comes from. So here's James Hall Brooks. Brooks studied briefly at the Princeton Seminary before moving to Miami University at Oxford, Ohio. He was the driving force behind the Niagara Bible Conferences that introduced Protestants from all over to the fundamental ideas of dispensationalism, including the restoration of Israel and a distinction between the saved and the damned. So here's our buddy Cyrus Ingersoll Scofield. He's a Southern Presbyterian and very influential author of the first modern Bible with chain references, the Scofield Reference Study Bible, published in 1909, the same year as Herbert Crowley's The Promise of American Life, was to be the first definitive scientific interpretation of the Word of God, complete with commentary and explanatory notes written in the margins by Scofield and his team of consulting editors. In 1917, it was revised by Scofield in an attempt to attribute exact dates to biblical verse. So here they are trying to establish the Bible as a historical document. Now, it's not possible. There's no way that we've been able to confirm any of this. I know that this is going to upset Christians all over the place, but it's not a provable document. There's many authors to this Bible. and then many interpretations, and a lot of it translations. So you've got translations of interpretations of interpretations. So you want to talk primary, secondary source material. This is like beyond quaternary, whatever, like 8th level sources, 10th level sources. It's really not sourceable. So a forensic historian or an investigative journalist or somebody interested in using historical method isn't going to be interested in the Bible at all as a historical document, although a large population of the people believe it to be. And this is where the trick is. I mean, that's the main causal factor for Israel being there. That's the main argument that the Jews make, is that it was given to them by God in the Bible. So this edition of the Bible had its origin in the increasing conviction of the editor through 30 years of study and use of the scriptures as pastor, teacher, writer, and lecturer upon biblical themes, that all of the many excellent and useful editions of the Word of God left much to be desired. So he's trying to improve the Word of God by adding scientific footnotes like we do with our articles. So Scofield's version, containing the entire text of the King James Version originally published in 1611, becomes the modern-day theological entering wedge, acting as the ultimate authority, impressing both a sense of fear of the future and a state of helplessness into its hundreds of millions of followers. Scofield, an early proponent of gap theory and progressive creationism, the belief in a gradual unfolding of life as determined by God, a recognition of intelligent design, and gap theory, a new beginning put between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1-2. Gap theory, as advocated by Scofield, expands biblical history to millions of years rather than the previously taught thousands of years of theistic evolution, opening the door to Darwinism. So I don't know how many people know that, but Scofield, right after the first verse of the Bible, adds gap theory, and that adds millions and millions of years. And I'm assuming it's because Darwinism becomes much more believable when you say that we've gone from ape to human in millions of years, not just a few thousand. And we know Darwinism and this theory of evolution is really at the basis of human motion. Okay, evolution. This is what Comte said, that we needed some sort of undergird or foundational idea that humanity moves forward innately just by nature. And then they could put Comte's positivism on it, and then human progress myth, and then progressivism at the turn of the 20th century. So the Bible is a progressive unfolding of truth. That's in the introduction. So on page 2 of the 100th anniversary edition of the 1917 Scofield Bible, which is the one I got here, my wife got it for me, I think, for my birthday. Okay, so we're taking it from the actual sources, not a first printing, but I would take that over something that I see online. So it talks about the Pentateuch, otherwise known as the Torah, tells undeniably the order of the experience of the people of God in all ages, a revelation of the true history, and such a history we find in words of matchless grandeur and in an order which, rightly understood, is absolutely scientific. In the Pentateuch, therefore, we have a true and logical introduction to the entire Bible. And I added emphasis there on the word scientific, because this is really what they're trying to do. And science and God, up until this point, weren't really associated. It's actually, it's contentious. Scientific man versus God. This is going back to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Renaissance. One further note, Woodrow Wilson's father created the Southern Presbyterian Church and served as its leader for nearly 40 years. He was central in organizing the breakup of the Presbyterian Church in America into a North and South. Woodrow Wilson's father. And there are links to these men's fathers all over the place like that. So you can see that it's not these guys coming up with it. They're just the latest in the pursuit of the great work, right? Like Trump and Musk today getting close to the technate is a step that these guys only dreamed of 100 years ago. Also in 1909, Harvard University president Charles W. Eliot, author of The New Education, he's Phi Beta Kappa as well, Charles W. Eliot, by the way, lectures to the Harvard Summer School of Theology, speaking repeatedly of a new Bible, resulting from historical study of its books in the light of recent researches and of new knowledge of the development of the world and mankind. Eliot stating the importance of this new religion and outlining the intellectual progress of the last century. So you guys can go and read that. I've thrown it right here. You can zoom right in. I've even underlined all those quote sources. 1909. Okay, same year that the study Bible, the Schofield Study Bible was first introduced, we have Harvard University president, Phi Beta Kappa, Charles W. Eliot, promoting it to its theological summer school. So the religion of a multitude of humane persons in the 20th century may therefore be called, without inexcusable exaggeration, a new religion. Not that a single one of its doctrines and practices is really new in essence, but only that the wider acceptance and better actual applications of truth on a large scale are new. So he's saying, you know, the thought of, obviously, the book of Revelations has always been in the Bible, but it wasn't it wasn't made popular. And these are the men that did it. And that's from the Congregationalist and Christian World Event and Comment, President Eliot's New Freedom. See also Harvard Theological Review, October 1909. And that's, I believe, what that is. If not, it's just another source to add. So today, dispensationalism has morphed into a progressive version that differs slightly from its classic definition, although the main adherents are still widely shared among them, including separation between the faiths of the Christian church and that of Israel, a future pre-tribulation rapture, and an eventual kingdom of peace lasting for 1,000 years. The kingdom of heaven sounding very much like the mid-1800s vision promised by Henri de Saint-Simon and the utopian socialists, and almost verbatim to Marx's own theory of the withering away of the capitalist state. It's the same game plan. It's the same vision of the future that both Christians of the dispensational belief and socialists of the Marxist believe and promote and talk about and promise. An ominous continuity then from Marx and Simon to the early 1900s ethical socialist movement, where we see a natural coming together of the American progressives, Brandeis, Lippmann, Frankfurter, Fabian socialists, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Graham Wallace, close personal friends with Lippmann, and the Christian social gospel movement. Okay, Walter Rauschenbusch's kid marries Brandeis' daughter. We'll get to that. William Eugene Blackstone wrote the very popular Jesus is Coming, God's Hope for a Restless World in 1878. And it became a sort of manifesto for all dispensationalist thought. These guys that we're showing, they're actually writing the manifesto, whether it's Herbert Crowley or William Eugene Blackstone. And here's some more historical artifacts reminiscent of a forensic investigation into history. So this is as close to a primary source as I will ever get for this 1891 Blackstone petition. So Blackstone traveled to Palestine in 1890, 1891 and witnessed Leon Pinsker's new movement, a Rothschild-sponsored development program of agricultural communities in Rishon LeZion and Nahalet Yehuda. It was during this visit Blackstone had the idea of organizing the first conference between Christians and Jews. Historians regard the Conference of Christians and Jews on the Past, Present, and Future of Israel to be the first interfaith conference between Christians and Jews held in the United States. So we just finished talking about in Brandeis Part 3, American Zionism and the Making of Israel, how the Rothschilds were there as early as 1880s with their experiment. Well, look at Blackstone's there too. He's hanging out, looking. He's attracted, actually. He's going there because he heard that the Rothschilds are developing agricultural communities there. You know, he's establishing, the Rothschilds are, the first Jewish settlements. So this guy's on his way. He's going to go check it out. And he reports on it. And, you know, this largely is the catalyst to this push that we see just so prominent within Christianity today, this infection that has gotten in there and created disease. This Zionist belief, if you're a Christian watching this and you've been supporting, Israel throughout this time, I'm showing you primary sources why you shouldn't. And so I can speak for myself, and this journey to the truth has been a series of heartbreaks, but we get over them. Okay. The only one left in my world is Kurt Russell. No. Where were our anti-establishment punk rockers and rock and rollers during COVID? Where was Rage Against the Machine? I won't do what you tell me, right? No, it's like, yes, sir, I'll do whatever you tell me. Yes, sir, I'll do whatever you tell me. That broke my heart when I saw that shit, but I should have known, because oftentimes the Rage Against the Machine has a red star on a green background. And, you listen to Morello long enough, you'll quickly see he's a socialist. So, yeah, your heart's going to be broken here, but it's not meant to break you. This is actually empowering you. Right? This is how you gain a thicker skin, become a more well-rounded individual. You're less dependent on things that you don't know anything about or people you've never met. And a well-developed individual is a perfect antidote to a tyrannical government or a tyrannical mind, right? Even in your own mind, you can be tyrannical to yourself. But we must become well-developed. And so, first things first, history. How did this all happen? So in 1891, Blackstone famously published the Blackstone Memorial Petition in response to what he had apparently witnessed in Palestine. The petition was presented to U.S. President Benjamin Harrison in an effort to gain American support for the Jewish situation in Central Europe and to secure the holding at an early date of an international conference to consider the condition of the Israelites and their claims to Palestine as their ancient home. So there they mention some future international conference, and that would end up being the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. This is where Israel was finally established. We talk about 1917. Yeah, it was published and written, but there was those 2 years after 1917, it was tumultuous. There was all kinds of things going on, the Sykes-Picot backstab and all kinds of political maneuvering going on. And Brandeis felt from his home in America that he was feeling like the British were starting to renege on their promise. So he actually gets on a boat, goes to Paris, goes and meets Arthur Balfour to his face in his apartment and establishes Israel right there. And that's the documents that I show in the last video, the British documents of foreign policy or whatever, 1919 to 1939. Yeah, three of the four people in that apartment were members of the House of Truth. And maybe Balfour visited there during his Washington visit. We don't know. But anyone that was anyone in Washington, sooner or later, came to the House of Truth, right? We know that. And secondly, on that paragraph, they're talking about this state of pogroms that are going on. There's all kinds of offenses and egregious things going on against the Jews, allegedly, and this is what Blackstone is talking about. So he's approaching the U.S. president, asking him to do something about it. And what we're talking about is the Pale settlement. Anybody's heard of the Pale settlement? It's basically the Polish-Lithuanian border. Something we really just know today is Middle Europa, Central Europe. Is there any fighting going on there right now in Central Europe? It's been perpetual war there ever since these assholes. So it's interesting, right? They're talking about a Paris Peace Conference, it's 30 years in the future. So this 1891 petition is a full 5 years before Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat and 6 years before Herzl is named president of the Zionist organization at the first Zionist Congress in Basel. So Harrison acknowledged Blackstone in the memorial, but chose not to involve himself, and there the petition remained until it was revived in 1916 by who? Zionist leader Louis Brandeis, nearly 30 years later, and presented to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. This time it gained the necessary traction. So introduced to the petition through his personal confidant, Nathan Strauss, who we talked about earlier, as one of Brandeis's lieutenants, maybe groomers, Louis Brandeis would then formulate a plan to have the petition presented to Wilson and was adamant that he wasn't mentioned at all. Brandeis wanted to step right out of it. By influencing the president strictly from the perspective of a fellow Presbyterian Christian, Brandeis hoped Blackstone's appeal for Jewish aid in Central Europe would hold more weight or have more impact, and it did. So Blackstone had sent letters to Wilson as early as November 4th, 1914, asking for his assistance in the coming redemption of Israel. He attached a copy of Jesus is Coming. So he's trying to scare the shit out of Woodrow Wilson, and then he's trying to, this is a dialectic in the making. You can clearly see it. And I invite you to zoom in on the documents there because there's very interesting names. So on November 10th, Wilson thanked Blackstone for his book through his personal secretary, Joseph Tumulty. Tumulty? I don't know how to pronounce it. On April 5th, 1916, Blackstone sent Wilson his brochure, The Times of the Gentiles and the War in the Light of Prophecy, in which he predicted a return of the Jews to Palestine. When? 1917 or 1918? He was 1 year off. Actually, he's right on. Okay, he's right on. 1917 is the Balfour Declaration. Late 1917, I mean, he's pretty accurate there, even though it wasn't totally official till 1919. So a letter from Nathan Strauss to William Eugene Blackstone dated May 8th, 1916 reads, "It would have done your heart good to have heard Mr. Brandeis assert what a valuable contribution to the cause your document is. In fact, he agrees with me that you are the father of Zionism, as your work antedates Herzl." So that's Nathan Strauss, Brandeis, both saying that this Christian dispensationalist is the father of Zionism. Now, I'm not saying that's the end all and be all of all evidence, because we can go back to the Quakers and the Pilgrims and their support of Israel. I mean, Salem is Jerusalem. So this goes back to the 1600s and the founding of America. But at least in modern times, we can connect it to these people. We can prove it without a doubt. And that's why we choose this era. So Wilson was presented with the 1916 Blackstone Memorial on May 5th, 1916. Attached was the original memorial with its 413 signatures, including, check these people out, John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, J. Pierpont Morgan, Russell Sage, Chauncey Depew, also Skull and Bones. Chauncey Depew he's a member of Skull and Bones. So, and nearly 400 others. Below, we once again see parallels being drawn between the dispensational movement and American progressives. So the principles laid out by Blackstone were remarkably similar to those of the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate for Palestine 3 decades later. This is why Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, leader of the American Zionist movement, asked William Blackstone to reissue his memorial petition in 1916, believing it incorporated the principles upon which a just and humanitarian Jewish homeland movement could be founded. Brandeis believed that Blackstone's petition, antedating as it did Theodor Herzl's own participation in the Zionist movement, was destined to become of historical significance and called Blackstone the true founder of Zionism. You're going to have to be patient with me on this one because my sources are a little bit messed up, because I did this whole story kind of on a stream of consciousness reminiscent of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And so I had well over 100 sources. And I got a little confused here, admittedly, but I am going to rectify this. We've got like 150 sources for all 10 stories and more, but we wanted to include the most impactful, important, influential, respected. So there's a little mess up at the end, but I hope that you see that we're showing you an incredible amount of primary, secondary source material showing that, you know, this is what was happening. We talked about Charles Homer Haskins in the first Tools of the Trade video, one of the key members of the inquiry, and how he was in control of the American Historical Association and controlling how history was taught across the nation in secondary schools. That's why this is all, I mean, this should be social studies or I don't know what, but we should be being taught this in school, no? So May 22nd, 1916, Brandeis writes to Mr. Blackstone, I am very glad to know from your letter of the 15th of the memorial, which you are preparing to present to President Wilson, reviving the memorial which you presented to President Harrison 25 years ago. That document, antedating as it did Theodore Herzl's own participation in the Zionist movement, is destined to become a historical significance. And I trust that you may be as successful in securing support for this new memorial as you were a quarter of a century ago, which wasn't very successful at all. Strange thing to say. So in view of the work being directly undertaken by the Jewish Zionist organization, your memorial would presumably be most effective if it derives its support from non-Jews. I hope you will keep me fully informed of the progress that you are making and will advise me in advance when you are proposing to present the memorial so that we may give such aid as may be possible in rendering it effective. Best wishes, yours cordially, Louis Dembitz Brandeis. Stephen S. Weiss, one of Brandeis's inner corps lieutenants that we talked about already, communicated often with Blackstone on several matters concerning the Jew. Weiss, the rabbi of the Free Synagogue in New York, was an original member and vice president of the Brandeis-led Provisional Executive Committee for General Zionist Affairs, Herzl's former headquarters. So I think I've said this already, just like the Frankfurt School was moved to Columbia and Americanized. They did the same with the Zionist headquarters. They just moved it to New York and made Brandeis the head of it. Now, this is untold history, but we're showing you that it's actually real and very important to understand. So Brandeis had Blackstone address the Zionist General Congress in Philadelphia, July 2nd to the 5th, 1916. Blackstone spoke in front of 4,000 at the Metropolitan Opera House. Brandeis introduced Blackstone as the most important ally Zionism has outside of its own ranks. The only good Gentile, William Eugene Blackstone. So William Blackstone made a central contribution to American evangelical Judeo-centrism by offering a nationalist adaptation of Darby's premillennial dispensationalism. Blackstone crafted a middle path between futurist and historicist prophecy interpretation. His efforts to shape political discourse generated a great deal of intra-Jewish debate. So there are, within the Brandeis papers, 47 pages of personal documents regarding the Blackstone Memorial Petition. Today, it's just showing that there's much communication going on. So that's the kind of metadata, or the kind of things that you can glean from metadata. You may not be able to see what they're saying to each other in detail like these documents here, but there are 47 pages, which, you know, like the police will investigate your texts and your phone calls now to sort of piece together a crime. You can see it's the same thing. You can gather a lot from the metadata. And so a great place to go source Brandeis material is the Louisville University Brandeis School of Law Library. Because Brandeis was born there, they've named the law library at Louisville University after him. And this is where Frankfurter famously went in and stole documents and walked out with them under his arm and said that they were his and nobody's going to take them back. And he wasn't reprimanded, charged with anything. He just took valuable information, and it was about, allegedly, this meeting in Paris, 1919, with Balfour. So, you know, that may raise questions into the legitimacy of all of that, but still, There's no doubt, history has shown over and over, the proof is demonstrable, repeatable, observable, that this is really what the founding of Israel is, 1917, and completely associated with the British Mandate, the American involvement of the war, and the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court justice being a primary author in its cabling and final drafting. Okay, we've shown that. We're going to move on. So today, Blackstone, like the rest of the dispensationalists, occupy an obscure area of history seldom considered. Right? I just learned about this. I was in my 50s. So Blackstone helped found Biola University in Los Angeles and was its very first dean. Yet in 2013, during a commemoration of another Biola founder, Reuben A. Torrey, where a bronze plaque was presented upon which it stated Torrey and not Blackstone was the first dean of Biola. Blackstone seemingly erased from the history of the very university he helped found. As of 2019, they've named a student's residence after him, and on the website, they do finally acknowledge Blackstone's importance to the university as its first dean. So unfortunately, the plaque included the statements, Biola's first dean. At the time, many old-timers commented, that's not correct. William Blackstone was first dean. Written communication subsequently corrected this error, but the bronze plaque remains unaltered. Thus, nearly everyone today is unaware that William Blackstone, not R.A. Torrey, was Biola's first dean. You can see they cover their tracks. So the social gospel movement, the second prong of this attack on Christianity through Brandeis' son-in-law. Right, Walter Rauschenbusch's son and Brandeis' daughter, Mary. Okay, this is the father of social gospel. So the name of Walter Rauschenbusch is synonymous with the social gospel. Socialism offered not only a radical critique of American political and economic institutions, it also offered the seal symbols and sense of participation in a world transforming cause often associated with Christianity itself. We've talked about this. So Walter Rauschenbusch was born in Rochester, New York in 1861 to Karl Augustus Heinrich Rauschenbusch and Caroline Rump. Walter's father, a German Lutheran turned Baptist clergyman, arriving in the U.S. in 1846 after studying at Berlin and Bonn universities. Once arriving in New York, he entered the Baptist Communion and in 1858 was head of the German department of the Rochester Theological Seminary, where he would remain for 30 years. So he's a converted German Lutheran to Baptist. So following high school, Walter traveled to Germany with his father, where he studied for 4 years, 1878 to 1883, at an evangelical German prep school in Gütersloh and Berlin University, near where his father was born. And upon returning to the United States, would follow his father to the Rochester Theological Seminary, where he gained a doctorate in divinity in 1886. Walter VI, in a succession of ministers, began his pastorate at the Second German Baptist Church in Hell's Kitchen, New York. Still there. At least the buildings are. I checked. So Rauschenbusch felt it the responsibility of the church to improve the deplorable urban conditions in the tenements brought on by industrialization, and along with several others, founded the entire social gospel movement through the creation of the Brotherhood of the Kingdom. So when they say improve the deplorable urban conditions in the tenements brought on by industrialization, that is the same argument the socialists are making. That's the same argument the ethical Fabians are making. That's the same argument the American progressives are making. And it's hard to argue with that, right? The amelioration of the poor is something that we would like to see, I think. But here we are 100 years after these promises and empty. And, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but the K through 12 education system, when it was adopted by Freemasons, Edward Everett and Horace Mann in Massachusetts, they promised that it was going to not only ameliorate the poor, but the need for penitentiaries. He figured this new education was going to create a well-developed individual that was going to know differences from right and wrong and be able to be masters of their own domain and stay out of trouble. Well, the only way you're going to do that is if liberal arts were still attached to our education, which they're not. This is why they took them out. This is why they're largely getting over on the television viewing public, because they don't know how to put two and two together. I mean, we say this all the time on this side. It's like, oh my God, trying to talk to these people. It's like, oh, you could put all the information in front of them. They still deny. It's cognitive dissonance. Yeah, but it's also, they don't have the skills. I mean, yeah, some of you are, and I'm talking to, educated people, but when you look at their logical process and the things that they say and how they arrive at conclusions, it's a faulty system, and they're using insufficient criteria when determining what the truth is. Oh, my dad said this, or, a great example is the Bible. So the social gospel movement was an outgrowth of Christian socialism, and Christian socialism, a new religion, first put forth by utopian socialist Henri de Saint-Simon. We've already mentioned him, to serve as an authority over the realm of industry and trade. So they're using this in a coordinated effort, and their intended demographic is industry and trade. It's like the efficiency, fatigue and efficiency books, and Josephine Goldmark, Florence Kelly, looking for proper transportation of goods. So the Brotherhood of the Kingdom movement, started by Rauschenbusch, representing to the Christian denominations what Walter Lippmann proposed to the secular as the Great Society. Christian socialism looking very much like the religious complement to progressivism. Louis Brandeis' daughter Elizabeth married Walter Rauschenbusch's son Paul in 1925, literally combining the two movements through their founders by marriage. August Heinrich Rauschenbusch, one of the earliest Baptist leaders in North America. No one man exerted a larger influence on the life of our churches than he did through his classroom preaching, newspaper writing, and books, and that is Walter Rauschenbusch's father, the converted Lutheran to Baptist. So this is a generation prior. So he's establishing, look at the regard to which everybody understood Walter Rauschenbusch's father. And where does he study but Germany? And where does he take his son? Back to the very same places that he did to learn. So Rauschenbusch's own shortly lived periodical magazine, For the Right, was created in the interest of the working people. For the Right set out the Declaration of Principles for the Christian Socialist Society of New York City. So he's, it's in the title of this magazine, and this business that he's creating. Rauschenbusch's stated goal was to apply the ethical principles of Jesus Christ so that our industrial relationships may be humanized, our economic system be moralized. We band together as Christian socialists. Page 91, Walter Rauschenbusch by Doris Robinson Sharp. And that's right here. So Rauschenbusch, much like Brandeis, was bringing together capital and labor. The social gospel movement, an extension of the efficiency movement, Brandeis was spearheading at the same time. Just as the Taylor Society was preaching scientific management of society, so too were the leaders of the social gospel. The Christian socialism that Rauschenbusch embraced stood aloof not only from Marxian doctrine, but also from any socialist party. We are concerned with principles, not with methods. We are evolutionists, not revolutionists. In this sense, we are socialist in the spirit rather than the letter. Page 91, Walter Rauschenbusch, Doris Sharp. And this is exactly what Lippmann, Crowley, and them all say about the creation of the New Republic. It's socialist in nature, but progressivism is the word that they wanted to use. So the motivation for this distinctly religious movement was supplied chiefly by the ethical impulses flowing from a progressive theology. Of the many perplexing issues growing out of industrialism, those that concerned the relations of labor and capital and their interpretation by socialism so largely dominated the interests of socially minded clergymen in this decade that the social gospel may without question be described historically as a response of Protestantism to those specific situations. So centrality of the labor problem in all realistic discussions of urban religious conditions adds further weight to this definition. The problems of an industrial civilization remain the central interest of social Christianity. I mean, they were the first charity. Christianity, like if you went into a town and you had no food and nowhere to stay, the first place that people would go was where? The church. So you can see how they tied into it, knowing this, just like they tied into the American progressives. And it's all an appeal to our liberal sentimentalities. Not one of us out here wants to see somebody die of starvation, right? Only labels make us believe those things. But there's not a conservative or a leftist out there that wishes to see people die of starvation. So Francis Greenwood Peabody, professor of ethics and theology at Harvard from 1880 until his retirement in 1913, the Unitarian studied at Heidelberg and then Leipzig and Halle universities. So this is starting to totally associate parallels this with the origins of social science and law, which we're going to get into pretty quick. The origins of our K through 12 education, which we already talked about, and the establishment of the American University Association, the network across America, the predecessor to the internet. So Charles Richmond Henderson, Baptist minister, Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts, Bachelor of Divinity. In 1892, he was asked by William Rainey Harper, president of the University of Chicago, a devout Baptist himself, and the University of Chicago Baptist, created by John D. Rockefeller, a Baptist, to join the newly formed faculty of social science at the University of Chicago as a professor of sociology. Now, I just said that we're going to get into the creation of the social sciences in part 6, the science of law. We identify this, another entirely different group of guys that'll blow your mind. But it's the same, you'll see the same pattern in the manipulation of groups of men. The first independent sociology department in the United States, founded the same year Henderson arrived by Albion Woodbury Small. Now, that's one of the names we're going to get into. Small, one of the very founders of sociology, also studied at Leipzig and Berlin, and then Johns Hopkins before moving to Chicago University. But more on him in Brandeis, Part 6, The Science of Law. Henderson, a member of the American Economic Association and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. So we've covered that in part 1, how all these guys become presidents of these associations and makes them very influential in the direction of the future of these concepts, whether it's economics or history or the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. They all take turns being presidents, steering the wheel. Right? This is the definition of government and cybernetics, to steer society as if you were steering a ship. This is why I often use the word moorings, because they do too. They wanted to remove our moorings, the things that we valued and kept us straight. They wanted them removed. This is what they talk about. So William Rainey Harper, also a professor of Semitic languages at Yale. So he would know all about the 77 branches, wouldn't he? 1886, and named Woolsey Professorship of Biblical Literature in 1889. Principal of the Chautauqua College of Liberal Arts. That's the word I was looking for earlier. And there's the connection to this other strange traveling Christian recruitment movement. And it's the first group of people that habitate the Pacific Palisades on the outskirts of Los Angeles that is now highly populated by Jewish elite that just, was on fire. So William Rainey Harper, also I've already gone there, Chautauqua Liberal Arts, right? And later the entire Chautauqua movement. So William Rainey Harper, he's one of the movers and shakers of that movement. So you're starting to see that there's multiple movements going on within Christianity, but they're all steering towards the perfectibility of man and a future utopia that sounds a lot like Marxist socialism, or, that thing. So he was a key member of the organizational committee that created the University of Chicago and was elected its first president. The American Baptist Education Society donated $400,000 to the university's founding, and John D. Rockefeller donated $600,000. The land was donated by Jekyll Island Club member Marshall Field So Washington Gladden, pastor of the First Congregational Church of Columbus, Ohio, he's a pragmatist. So there's a connection back to William James and this idea that don't question our methods and means. It's about the ends, this promise of something we haven't seen. Utopia. So William Newton Clark, also an ordained Baptist minister. 1856, he received a BA, Bachelor of Arts, and a BD, a Bachelor of Divinity, at Colgate Seminary. So you see here, they're all going to these local colleges that offer liberal arts. And just like we're going to see in 6, the only way they're allowed to go to Europe to gain this further education that's not offered in the States is to first study and become at least a Bachelor of Arts. So that means that they're at least well studied in grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the basics of arithmetic, or the further, what's outside of the general education on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So it's a real gathering of all of the information, right? We talk about the scientific revolution. What are they doing? But they're saying, okay, we don't need God anymore. We can now go around the earth in our setting and start measuring things and figuring things out for ourselves. And that's really what we see today. It's culminated in the scientific expert standing in the Oval Office, allowing his kid to pick his nose and rub it on the Resolute. Because we are enslaved to the opinion of the scientific expert. None of you have lived in a democracy before. Never has your vote counted. Only as a poll for the elite to see how people are voting. And I've said this to a few people lately about polls. We got to get over this misunderstanding of what polls are too. They aren't an indicator of public opinion. They're persuaders of it or pushers of it. They're manipulators. They create public opinion. They're not telling you what the public opinion out or the word on the street is. Polls, Gallup lived in and worked in the same offices and days of Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda. They found that the poll was a very useful way to nudge society. So before you start using the word facts to say that, to argue your point, or polls, understand that that's stats, data, and facts. Those could be manipulated, which makes them subjective. And, you leave data, facts, and stats to a master of arts, they're going to create a pseudo environment, because they're masters of being able to communicate and paint pictures inside your head, like Walter Lippmann. So William Newton Clark, also an ordained Baptist minister, he received his BA, went to Colgate, lectured at Johns Hopkins, Oberlin, Harvard, Yale. He wrote an outline of Christian theology for the use of students in Hamilton Theological Seminary in 1894, which was then published in 1898 by Charles Scribner's Sons. In 1903, he wrote Huxley and Phillips Brooks. So he's coming sort of from the same milieu. And this book in behind is called The New Citizenship. Okay, we want to talk about words behind the word new. The New Citizenship. So Samuel Zane Batten, he wrote The New Citizenship and The New World Order. He entitled his book The New World Order. I bet you he wasn't laughed off the internet. So established the Commission on Social Service of the American Baptist Association. So we're just throwing some names out there. This is the grammar collection segment of Grammar, Logic, Rhetoric. Obviously, there's a lot of amazing history here that you're going to remember, but don't try to remember all their names. Not necessarily the first way through, but I encourage you to use this work as reference material. So salvation was expressed in social, ethical terms by these leaders of Protestant social thought. A social salvation was really included within the broad universalism of the kingdom of heaven on earth, a conception now beginning to emerge definitely as the ideal of a perfected human society. Okay. Rise of social gospel within the American Protestantism. Emphasis added, page 109. So Thomas Nixon Carver, studying under Progressive Father Richard T. Ely, or Eli, we've discussed him in episode 1, Tools of the Trade. He's a founding progressive. Some of the inquiry are direct disciples of him, and John Bates Clark at Johns Hopkins, making him the next wave of disciples of Nies and the German Historical School. Carver, the treasurer secretary of the American Economic Association. Ely, a world-renowned economist, founder and first secretary of the American Economic Association and leader of the progressive movement. Ely also just happens to be the founder of the Christian Social Union and wrote extensively on organized labor movements. His father, a devout Presbyterian, both Ely and Clark studied directly under Karl Nies at the University of Heidelberg. Ely also studying under Johann Caspar Bluntschli, the man who created one of the first codes of international law and war, and is a co-founder of the Institute of International Law. Bluntschli, heavily influenced by Hegelian ethical social theory, we see popularized in both Germany and the United States. So what does Hegel say? War is progress, peace is stagnation. And so Richard T. Ely, I encourage you to go look into him. He's a founding father of progressive movement and on the economist side. So he's influencing economists. So Professor Ely, who was perhaps the leading spirit in the group, found generous support for his new historical school of economics among the clergy, as we know, had joined the revolt against laissez-faire theory, in which attitude the association found its chief raison d'etre. So its whole reason for being was a revolt against laissez-faire theory. So this is where they attack the free market and then say, and still to this day, we believe it's capitalism, but it's really not. You know, capitalism is free market, and then it was the monopolization, this overtaking of any ability for us to compete with these people. And then they just shut the door. And ever since, they've been creating a socialist society somewhere between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we see that, and that's why I involved that quote, is because this pattern goes all the way back. This revolt against laissez-faire. You know, the Great Depression, that's what they fingered laissez-faire free market as the reason for the collapse. And it's still fooling people today. And JP Morgan is considered a progressive. So the expert, the social scientist in the middle, emerges in much of Henderson's work as the arbiter of social life. So he's following in line with Lippmann at the same time as having entering wedges come into our lives and steer us, manipulate, manage, govern. So he, Charles Richmond Henderson, closed citizens in industry with a note that churches, like the great trusts, were amalgamating, and that Protestant ecumenical was beginning to echo Roman Catholicism, which he called an international trust of religious forces. So he's showing, and we will show right at the end here, that churches are amalgamating too. And of course, this is the interfaith alliance. This is what they want, one big church to match with the one big government. And so he's noting that just as giant corporations are joining into trusts, so are a lot of the churches in the Protestant movement. So a social policy implies and assumes a certain philosophy of life and a certain religious faith. This faith proves its worth and reasonableness by its works. It is living and it is prophetic and creative. To us who believe in a progressive social policy, the world is not merely pushed forward by blind physical forces. It moves onward toward aims clearly set before the human will and realized gradually by concerted labor, directed by science. This policy is root and branch ethical. It is morality organized, vivified, guided by growing knowledge and inspired by faith. Programs in economic facts, in ideals. Okay. So in late 19th century America, the new science of sociology suddenly found itself the handmaiden and ready instrument of a somewhat distinct strain of ideas which begin religious and to an extent liberally progressive, were acceptable to the entrenched powers of university governors and presidents. So it is virtually impossible to extricate sociology and the social gospel in many instances, and to a large extent, sociology in America may be seen as an outgrowth of the social gospel. So the fellowship's wide range of interests was well exemplified in the program for the conference of 1898, at which 3 series of papers were presented: the prophets of Israel as social leaders, the rural population and the social movement, trade unions in New York, the social work of the church, a review of Sidney and Beatrice Webb's Industrial Democracy. Page 7, Walter Rauschenbusch and the Brotherhood of the Kingdom. So no aspect of the thought of social gospelers as a whole more effectively describes them as children of their age than does the word progressive. Applied first to advancing theological views, progressive later became a political catchword representative of a particular reform philosophy popularized by Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. So that the kingdom should be progressively realized by evolution indicates the close relation of social gospel thought to the intellectual and social ideology of the times. Okay, so they're laying it down just as we are, and it makes sense. So, but by all odds, the most important writings by members of the Brotherhood were those of Walter Rauschenbusch, whose epochal book, Christianity and the Social Crisis, appearing in 1907, made its author at once the acknowledged leader of the American social Christianity, and soon acquainted the Protestant world with the basic tenets for which the Brotherhood had long labored. A theology for the social gospel, regarded by many as his greatest, set the doctrine of the kingdom of God at the heart of social Christianity. As stated earlier, Walter's son, Paul Arthur Rauschenbusch, would marry Louis D. Brandeis' daughter, Elizabeth, in 1925, and boxes of correspondence between the three found at Wisconsin Historical Society within the UW Madison Digital Archives indicate quite clearly that the same interests in labor, social justice, and reform that stirred Lewis in the first third of the 20th century also stirred his daughter and son-in-law a generation later. The husband and wife team of economists, best known for their work with Harold Groves, developing and securing the passage of Wisconsin unemployment compensation legislation, the first such legislation in the nation. So you can see that they are following along in daddy's footsteps. There's his daughter and the son of Walter Rauschenbusch, as told by Michael Rosenwald. Okay. You can see that's a profile from the Wisconsin Alumni Association, talking Washington Post profile. So what is the Washington Post but CIA enclave? It's born CIA. Honestly. So a rich collection of communication exists in those archives between Paul and Felix Frankfurter, Tom Corcoran, Thomas H. Eliot, and other federal officials that shows an important involvement within Franklin Delano Roosevelt's brain trust. Brandeis and Frankfurt are most influential here, again, consulting and advising U.S. presidents in the completion of much of the progressive work started under Woodrow Wilson. So we've come to the end of this video, and I want to end here with this guy. He is the president still right now, as far as I know, as of at least 6 months ago. He's the president of the Interfaith Alliance, Achieving Democracy Together. And who is he? But he is Brandeis's great-grandson of Baptist theologian Walter Rauschenbusch, a key figure in the social gospel movement. Okay. And we've just got more provenance stating that his family is still in major control of this coming together of socialism, Christianity, and other religions. So the Chautauqua Institute, the Center for American Progress, the New American Foundation, and the Aspen Institute. Okay, but he's also showing up on CNN, CBS, ABC. Now, I don't think he's one of the new Brandeisians, but he's certainly pushing the same ideas. Okay, so I have no source material here. I think that's why I included it all as we went. When I was actually publishing this just over a year ago, I was coming up against time restraints as we got later into the 10-part series. So I just included the source material name here. So you can see that's what we've done. So you're more than welcome to go and check into those and vet me all you want. But there is no doubt that Louis Dembitz Brandeis and Paul Rauschenbusch still influence the Christian denomination in ways that nobody really knows about, and have really influenced Christianity towards this dangerous belief that Palestine belongs to the Jew. So I encourage everybody to look more into what's happening there presently in Palestine and support the Palestinians, at least support the idea of Israel not being there anymore, being the aggressors. I appreciate you guys all being here, and we'll see you next time.